Government Order of the Day number 2.
Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill, first reading.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Minister Maurice Williamson.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Local Government and Environment Committee to consider the bill. Mr Speaker, the issue of managing earthquake-prone buildings has been considered by the Canterbury Earthquake Royal Commission, and a comprehensive review has also been undertaken by the Government. This is a significant issue with what I think is a very high level of public interest. Sir, about 15 to 25,000 buildings, and I guess that's one of the first problems we have, is no one knows exactly how many, across New Zealand could be earthquake-prone. I stress this doesn't include residential buildings. It doesn't include even apartments if it's less than 2 stories. They have to be multiple story apartment blocks to be included. 535 submissions were received on the Government's consultation document, which we released in 2012, outlining the proposals to improve a system for managing earthquake-prone buildings. More than 1,000 people attended the public meetings and the stakeholder meetings held all around New Zealand on the issue last year, sir. I attended a number of those meetings to hear very first-hand the public's concern about the issue. Sir, while rare, major earthquakes stand out from other hazards in terms of the very large impact they have as a single event, both in terms of fatalities and injuries, as well as economic losses. And the Christchurch earthquake of the 22nd of February 2011 provides a very dramatic example of that. Mr Speaker, both the Canterbury Earthquake Royal Commission and the review undertaken by the Government identified problems with the current system for managing earthquake-prone buildings, including significant information gaps and consistency of practice issues. A clear view has emerged from society's perspective that the current system for managing earthquake-prone buildings is not achieving an acceptable level of risk. Many earthquake-prone buildings are not being dealt with in a timely and cost-effective manner. So, Mr Speaker, this bill introduces a revised system for managing earthquake-prone buildings that, in my view, strikes a balance between protecting people from harm in an earthquake and managing the costs of strengthening or removing buildings. In a nutshell, we do not want to make every building in the country the gold-plated standard and actually make nearly every building unable to be economically used. On the other hand, we do not want people exposed to high risks of fatalities and injuries because the building owners are not required to do anything. So it's about striking a balance. The bill is very broadly in line with the recommendations in Volume 4 of the Canterbury Earthquakes Royal Commission's final report, while also taking into account views of submitters on the public consultation document and feedback from the public and stakeholder meetings. The bill moves to a system that has significantly greater role for central government, particularly in providing leadership and direction to make better use of the capability and resources of both central and local government. I now, sir, want to outline some of the key changes contained in this bill that I think are really quite useful. The bill is to provide better information and disclosure, sir, and so it will require territorial authorities to undertake a seismic capacity assessment of existing non-residential and multi-storey, multi-unit residential buildings in their district within 5 years from the commencement of this legislation. And we thought of that. That was what the Royal Commission recommended. 5 years was a realistic time. If you take 25,000 buildings, you divide that by 5, you get 5,000 a year. You divide that by 52 weeks, it's 100 buildings a week that will need to be assessed. That's a lot of work to be done. And while a lot of engineering capacity is being soaked up in Christchurch with the rebuild, any time frame shorter than that would have put a huge supply and demand on the engineering fraternity. So councils will follow a methodology to be specified and published by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment when undertaking those assessments. So the first concern we had is that that would be a different regime all around the country. We'll know the guidelines and the methodology will be very, very set for how you do the evaluation. It also provides for a public register containing information on the seismic capacity of buildings to be held by the Ministry. And, sir, I'd actually like to go further after we've got that public registry. I'd like to get it actually onto Google Maps and handheld devices, and people actually even walking into a building to have a cup of coffee, being able to tell what the seismic rating of that building is. And boy, would you see some market changes then when people weren't prepared to use a building because it wasn't at a realistic level. Setting the threshold for defining an earthquake-prone building and the level of strengthening required involves, as I've said already, balancing risk versus cost. And in this respect, the bill does it. It clarifies the current threshold for defining an earthquake-prone building, including that it applies to parts of the building as well as the whole. That's never been the case in the past. So it might be just the parapets or the verandas or something, a lion or a gargoyle or something on the front of the building that could be the earthquake-prone bit. The rest of the building may actually be okay. So this is the actual part of the building or the whole. And in practice, the threshold that is often referred to will be that of 34% of NBS, the new building standard. Now, I want to actually first get a response into Business New Zealand. When Mr O'Reilly saw this first published, the policy, he said, "Oh, I don't like it because it's one size fits all." Well, let me give you again, it's 34% of NBS, and NBS, that is the new building standard, is different in every town across the country. Kaitaia has almost no earthquake-prone issue at all, NBS is almost zero, and 34% is almost nothing. Wellington, on the other hand, is even a higher standard than Christchurch, even after the February earthquake. So to Mr O'Reilly, I say, no, it's not one size fits all. This policy is about 34% of the risk faced by the specific location and the seismic risk that is identified. The bill also clarifies the level of work required to fix an earthquake-prone building is only so that the building or the affected part is no longer earthquake-prone. There will be no requirement to go beyond the 34%. I would hope building owners do it where they think it's economically viable or where their customer base wants it. I know, for example, the banks have been demanding that every building their staff are in is 67%. But that's their call. That's a market call. They're individual private companies who can do what they... I don't know, for Mr Shane Jones's edification, I don't know what the supermarkets are demanding as their seismic standard, but they may actually have one. Well, after tonight, I think they'll need one. To help ensure earthquake-prone buildings are dealt with in a timely manner, the bill sets a national time frame of 20 years for building to be strengthened or demolished. Now, that's slightly different to the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission said 15 years. We felt that was just too tight on building owners from the time they were given it, and we've moved it by that 5 years out to 20 years. The assessment, the territorials have 5 years and then a 15 years after the assessment, giving you the 20 years. It provides for work on certain buildings defined in regulations to be prioritised, so things that are found to be quite now life-threatening to be given the first priority. It provides for exemptions from requirements to undertake work for certain buildings. It provides that owners of buildings that are Category 1 historic places under the Historic Places Act may apply to the Territorial Authority for an extension of another 10 years. So we're trying to keep the historic places a little bit protected and not force them to meet the same as just normal commercial buildings. But owners must manage the risk if any extension is granted. And the bill will also enable territorial authorities, which are building consent authorities, to issue building consents for required work on buildings that are earthquake-prone without requiring any upgrades to other circumstances. Now, I know the disability community were quite keen on making it mandatory that if you had to bring your building up to standard earthquake, you should have to bring all of the disabled access elements into it as well. We think that that is just too hard an ask on a building owner. Where it's possible, I hope they do. Where it's economically viable, I hope they do. But, Mr Speaker, in the end, we are not going to mandate it. And the Royal Commission said we should not mandate it, and we've agreed with what the Royal Commission. So, Mr Speaker, in a nutshell, I think this bill is good. I think it helps give us some protection to our heritage buildings, but it makes sure that commercial building owners get out and get their buildings assessed. It makes sure the public can go to a register and look at their building and find it out. Mr. Speaker, the bill will, in my view, ensure earthquake-prone buildings are dealt with in a timely manner by way of a nationally consistent system. It'll strike a balance between protecting the public from harm in an earthquake and managing the costs of strengthening or removing buildings, and it will ensure information about earthquake-prone buildings is made available to the public. Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Shane Jones.
Mr. Speaker.